The smell hit her first. Marin had been standing in the boarding corridor for 11 minutes. She'd counted, because counting was the only way to make the waiting feel something she was doing, rather than something being done to her. When the smell came, through the ventilation grate above her head, not the recycled cold of the ship's interior, something else, something that had no name in the vocabulary she'd grown up with, that made the back of her throat clench in a way that wasn't unpleasant and wasn't familiar, and made her think, for one dislocated second, of her grandmother's stories. Stories about before. She looked up at the grate. The man behind her in the queue didn't look up. Nobody looked up. They stood in their rows with their transit cards already extended, the same slightly forward lean of people who had learned that passive compliance was the fastest route to any destination, and they waited for the doors. Marin pocketed her card and breathed in again. Green, her grandmother had said. It smells like the color green. That never made sense to Marin until this moment. The doors opened. The Veth guide was already inside. It had been inside since before they loaded. Standing at the forward console with its back arrangements, folded into their resting symmetry, which Marin had learned meant something like patient attention. In the way a filing cabinet is patient. It did not turn when they boarded. It had the route memorized. It had given this tour, by Marin's estimate, approximately 4,000 times. Welcome aboard the Veth Cultural Exchange Conveyance Route 7, it said in Accord Standard, the flat synthetic approximation they all use now, designed by a committee to offend no one and communicate primarily to no one. Today, you will observe examples of Class F biological matter as part of the Reclamation theme installation. Please keep your hands within the designated gesture zones at all times. Photography is permitted in designated photography zones only. The experience will last approximately 3 hours. Please direct any translation inquiries to the console at seat row 8. Nobody said anything. Marin found a seat near the middle. The man who'd been behind her in the queue sat 2 rows forward and immediately looked at his communication device. A woman with 2 children sat across the aisle. The children pressed their faces against the viewport, but there was only the boarding corridor outside, gray, and lit with the neutral amber light that Veth designers apparently considered inoffensive to human retinas. The amber light was everywhere on the ship. After 7 years, Marin could no longer tell if she found it soothing, or if she had simply run out of the energy required to find it anything. 41 people on the conveyance. She counted those too. The doors sealed. The vehicle moved. The Veth guide said, "We will begin with overview of the classification system for recovered biological specimens. Class A through Class C materials have been reclaimed and processed into useful substrate compounds. Class D and Class E materials are held in preservation matrices aboard Reclamation Vessels 7 through 22. Today's installation features Class F materials, which are defined as biological specimens of insufficient substrate yield to justify processing, of sufficient complexity to warrant exhibition, for educational and cultural exchange purposes." Marin wrote the words down in the small notebook she kept. She was one of perhaps a dozen humans she knew who still wrote longhand. The Veth found the practice inefficient and slightly concerning, which was precisely why she continued it. She wrote, "It's insufficient substrate yield." She wrote. She looked at what she'd written, and then she drew a small horizontal line beneath it and did not write what she was thinking. What she was thinking was that these were the words for trees. She was thinking this because her grandmother had told her what trees were, using the words from a book her grandmother had kept hidden in the lining of a travel pack for 30 years. The book was gone now. Confiscated during the 3rd processing review when Marin was 11, she'd watched her grandmother hand it over with the perfectly calibrated expression of someone who had rehearsed not flinching. But the words remained. Marin had been reading from it since she was 4. She could recite 30 pages of it from memory while her face did something completely different. Her grandmother had called the book A Field Guide to Northern European Flora. She had called it, privately, between the two of them, her Bible. The conveyance moved through the ship's interior transit corridors, then through the pressurized junction to the installation complex. and the amber light outside the viewports changed to something cooler and more deliberate, the specific blue-white that the Veth used to signal an educational context. Marin had lived under Veth administration long enough to read their light the way she'd once read weather. The first stop was what the guide called the Biodiversity Gallery. It was a large room. That was the most honest thing Marin could say about it. It was a large room with the correct humidity levels and the correct temperature gradients and long cases of transparent composite along every wall, and inside the cases arranged with the precise care of people who had studied the concept of natural abundance without ever having stood inside it, plants. Marin stood very still. She was not the only one. The children pressed up against the glass. Several adults who'd had the look of people completing an obligatory continuing education requirement stopped completing it and stood with their hands at their sides and their mouths slightly open. An old man in the row behind Marin made a sound that she recognized as him trying not to make a sound and then making it anyway, a small rough exhale that wasn't quite a word. She looked at a fern. It was behind glass. It was lit from below and above with spectrally calibrated light. A small label on the case said Polypodiopsida, Class F Specimen 7, 41, Acquisition Province, Earth Northern Hemisphere, circa Reclamation Year 0. Grandmother had pressed a fern inside the field guide when Marin was 6. She had shown Marin how to lay it flat against the page and close the book slowly. She had said, "Remember the shape. If you only remember one thing, remember the shapes." Marin looked at the shape. It was exactly as she remembered. Every articulation of every frond, the way it repeated the pattern of itself at every scale. She didn't have the word for that, the mathematical word. Her grandmother hadn't known it either. The way the whole thing was structured like a sentence that kept saying the same word in smaller and smaller voices until it was too small to hear, but you knew it was still speaking. This specimen represents a Polypodiopsida family member, the guide said, commonly referred to in pre-reclamation human linguistic traditions as a fern. The specimen was among 23,612 botanical units extracted from the class preservation queue and allocated to this installation. The Veth Reclamation Authority acknowledges the educational value of maintaining representative samples of Class F biological matter for the purposes of cross-species cultural understanding. The old man behind Marin said quietly, "My father had a garden." Nobody answered him, but Marin heard the woman with the children grip her daughter's shoulder. Not in warning, the other kind of grip. She wrote in her notebook, 23,612 units. She wrote. Out of how many? She didn't write the answer. Because she'd done the calculation before. She'd done it with numbers she'd pulled from 3 different public Veth archives and triangulated the way her grandmother had taught her to triangulate things you weren't supposed to know. The answer was a percentage so small that writing it down felt like the last page of something. The tour continued. They saw more cases, mosses and lichens and 3 types of grass and a small flowering plant, the label called angiospermae, that had pink flowers the size of a thumbnail, and that one of the children reached out to touch before her mother said, very quietly, "Don't. Let her be." Marin wasn't sure which one she meant, the child or the flower, and maybe she wasn't sure either. There was a section of the gallery devoted to what the guide called Fauna Class F adjacents, which were insects. Butterflies. There were 16 species of butterfly behind separate cases, lit with the same precise care as the plants, catalogued with the same precise labels. And Marin stood in front of one, Lepidoptera, brown and cream, wingspan approximately 6 centimeters, acquisition provenance, Earth, Western Europe, and thought about her grandmother's description of a garden in August. The way she'd spread her hands to show the movement of them. The way she'd said, "They land on you, Marin. They just land on you like you're part of the world." Marin pressed her thumb against the glass over the butterfly's wing, and then she pressed it harder, and then she put her hand in her pocket. She wrote nothing. The guide led them back to the conveyance. The next stop, it said, would be the mountain observation platform, where they would see a geological formation in active substrate modification, which meant She'd determined from previous research, a mountain being mined. They drove through a corridor that opened into a vast excavation space, and through the viewports she could see the mountain. It had been a mountain anyway. Now it was a mountain with its side removed. Teeth, processing equipment, moving across its exposed face like something eating deliberately, methodically, without interest in what it was eating. The guide described mineral extraction yields. It described substrate conversion efficiency. It described the VETH concept of progressive terrain optimization. It used the word reclamation 11 times in 4 minutes, and not once did the pert sound like what the word meant to Marin, which was something taken back, returned, restored. The VETH word for what they were doing was not reclamation. Marin didn't know the VETH word. She suspected if she did know it, she would find it cleaner and more honest. The way a clinical word for a violent thing is honest, precisely because it doesn't pretend. She looked at the mountain's open face, and she counted the striations in the exposed rock. She could see where water had once moved. Something had once grown. The rock remembered it, in the way rock remembers things in the shape of absence. 41 humans on this conveyance, looking out these viewports. 41 out of how many on this ship? How many ships? She knew those numbers too. She kept them, in the notebook, in the margins, in the small, cramped handwriting that her grandmother had taught her. She learned was also, how her grandmother's grandmother had written, learned in a world where paper was expensive, and you didn't waste what you had. The tour continued. The shopping complex was the part that made Marin's hands cold. It was a large commerce installation in the residential sector, where human vendors had been allocated stalls to sell goods produced under VETH-approved manufacture protocols. And it was, by the standards of anywhere Marin had lived in the past 7 years, lively. There were voices, there were children running. Someone was selling food that smelled of spices, that Marin could not name, but that sat in her chest like the memory of something important. The guide stopped them here, for what it called cultural integration supplementary time, and Marin understood this meant a rest break. She walked away from the group. Not far. She was not stupid. She had not survived 7 years of VETH administration by being stupid. She walked to the edge of the commerce corridor where a viewport looked out into the ship's main atrium, and she stood at the viewport and breathed. A VETH compliance officer was stationed at the corridor junction 40 meters away. Marin could see its sensor array oriented toward the crowd, performing its standard population analysis. The compliance officers were not guards. Technically, the VETH had been at significant pains to ensure that humans understood the compliance officers were not guards. They were population welfare monitors. This distinction was, in Marin's experience, identical in practice to the distinction between a cage and an enclosure, which the VETH also maintained was significant. She looked at the officer. The officer's array swept across her position and moved on. She looked back out the viewport. The atrium was enormous. VETH ships were always enormous. Built to a scale that Marin had been informed was simply practical for their physiological requirements, but that had the effect, probably incidental, of making every human on board feel like something kept in a pocket. She could see 4 other conveyances moving through the atrium's transit corridors on their routes. Other tours, 3 and Route 4 she knew, took humans to the Linguistics Documentation Center, where VETH archivists recorded human speech patterns for research purposes. Route 11 went to the Medical Study Annex. There were 16 routes in total. Route 7 was the only one that ended at the forest. Marin turned back from the viewport. The group was beginning to reassemble near the guide's signal post. She walked back. She did not walk quickly. She walked at the pace of someone who has been told they have 3 hours and has 3 hours, and is using them as designated. The guide led them back to the conveyance. The final stop on today's route, it said, is the Central Class F installation, designated Exhibition Zone 7. You will be led along a designated observation path through a preserved ecosystem comprising 11.3 hectares of Class F biological matter, including arboreal specimens, ground-level flora, and a curated representative sample of the associated fauna and micro-ecosystem elements. Please remain on the path. Please do not touch the specimens. Photography is permitted in all zones within Exhibition Zone 7, except the core preservation area is marked with amber indicators. 11.3 hectares. Marin did the mathematics. She kept her face completely still while she did it. 11.3 hectares was approximately 28 acres. A small wood, a copse. The kind of thing that in her grandmother's stories had been so ordinary, so available. People built houses next to them and walked through them on Sunday mornings without thinking about it. Without knowing they were walking through something that was keeping the air in shape, that was in conversation with the soil and the water table, and the insects and the birds in a language so old it had no speakers anymore. 28 acres. Her grandmother had said, "In the mountains near my mother's village, you could walk for 3 days in forest and never see the edge." The conveyance slowed, and then the doors opened and the smell came again. The same smell from the boarding corridor, stronger now, overwhelmingly stronger. And Marin was on her feet before she knew she'd decided to stand. And the woman across the aisle was on her feet. And the old man was on his feet, with one hand braced against the seat back. And all stood up in the conveyance the way people stand when something has rearranged the air they're breathing into something they recognize at a depth below language. She walked out into the forest. The path was smooth composite under her feet. The amber guide lights marked it at regular intervals. The VETH observation cameras were positioned at 3-meter heights along the designated route, angled precisely to maintain full surveillance coverage while creating the minimum visible intrusion into the sightlines. Marin noticed all of this. She cataloged it the way her grandmother had taught her to catalog things, because her grandmother's rule was, "See the room before you feel it, or the feeling will make you miss the room." She saw the room, and then she felt it. The trees were not tall by the standards she'd read about. These were the trees that had fit, the ones that could be reduced and managed and maintained under artificial light, in 11.3 hectares of enclosed deck space, mostly birch and ash and some kind of oak that had been kept pruned to a height the ceiling clearance allowed. But they were real. The bark was real. The light that came through the canopy, not sunlight, the installation lighting, carefully spectrally calibrated, caught in the leaves the way she had read about, and her grandmother had described, but that no description had ever actually conveyed the specific trembling green gold of light through living leaves that apparently no artificial lighting system had ever perfectly replicated, because here it was doing something to her vision that she had no prior reference point for. She put out her hand and touched a birch tree. The guide said from behind her, "Please refrain from contact with the specimens." She did not remove her hand. She stood with her palm flat against the bark of the birch tree, and she felt the texture of it, papery layered texture that she had read described as white, but was in fact not white at all, but was cream and silver and the faintest gray-green of something alive, and she felt the solidity of the living wood beneath the bark, and she kept her hand there. The guide said, "Visitor, please comply with installation regulations. Contact with class specimens is prohibited." The compliance officer stationed at the path, junction 20 meters back, had its array oriented toward her. She could feel it without looking. She had gotten very good at feeling it. The old man with the garden was standing 2 meters away. He was looking at her hand on the tree. He did not look at the compliance officer. Marin said quietly, so quietly that only he could hear, "When did you last touch a tree?" He looked at her. His eyes were wet. He said, "I was 9 years old." She nodded. She kept her hand on the tree. The bark was warm, warmer than she'd expected, warmer than the ambient temperature of the installation, the specific warmth of something living and working, metabolizing, respiring, doing the slow and continuous and completely indifferent biochemical labor of being alive. "Visitor," the guide said. "Final notice. Failure to comply will result in tour termination and a notation in your cultural exchange compliance record." She took her hand off the tree. She took her hand off the tree because she had done what she came to do, which was not to touch the tree. The tree was real. The tree was confirmed. She could add that to everything else she had been confirming for 7 years, adding to the margins of the notebook and the architecture of the things she was building in the margins. She had touched the tree so that she would know, in her hands, not only in her mind, specific temperature and texture of what they were talking about. When you built something that required other people to understand what they fighting to get back, the temperature mattered. The texture mattered. The small physical truths that description alone couldn't carry. She walked on. The path curved through the installation and the group moved with it, mostly silent, with that particular quality of human silence that is not emptiness but fullness. Too much to speak, or not enough words for what needed speaking. The children had stopped running. They walked close to their mother, and they turned their heads left and right, taking in everything, filing it somewhere below conscious memory, somewhere the VETH compliance systems couldn't catalog and assess. Marin walked and she looked and she wrote. She wrote in the notebook as she walked. The guide did not comment on, because she had noted previously that the guide did not classify writing as contact with specimens. She wrote the dimensions she could estimate. She wrote the species she could identify from her grandmother's field guide descriptions. She wrote the light quality and the specific acoustic quality of the space. The way sound moved differently here, absorbed by the leaf mass and the irregular surfaces. A softness to the air that the ship's interior never had, because the ship's interior was all hard angles and composite surfaces, and the sound bounced between them with the efficiency of a space that had never been designed to comfort. She had been writing for 7 years. She had 63 notebooks cached in various locations she did not think about consecutively, because thinking about them in sequence created a cognitive pattern that VETH behavioral monitoring systems were capable of detecting in communication logs, facial expression analysis, and body language assessment. She thought about each notebook separately, in isolation, in the way that water doesn't think about where it's going, it just finds the low ground. The notebooks contained species lists, dimension estimates, soil analysis observations made with tools she'd acquired. Through a distribution of small inoffensive trades, that no single trade made significant, acoustic measurements she'd taken with a modified communication device. The nutrient content of every food item, she'd been able to access a chemical, analysis of population numbers, ship manifest fragments, transit route schedules, the sleep cycle patterns of VETH compliance officers she'd been able to observe over time. 3 years' worth of atmospheric composition readings taken from the ventilation maintenance junction, 2 decks below her residential allocation, and on the last used page of Notebook 63, in the smallest handwriting she could produce while keeping it legible, the 17-step sequence that her contact on Route 11 had worked out over 4 years of access to VETH medical research archives, which described, in a botanist, or a geneticist, or someone who had become both out of necessity could follow, you would need to do if you wanted to take 11.3 hectares of living forest and make it capable of something the VETH had not calculated when they designated it Class F and deemed it of insufficient substrate yield. She was on Step 11. She had 3 more visits to Exhibition Zone 7, authorized in her cultural exchange schedule. She needed the 3rd visit. Steps 12 through 15 required direct contact with the soil of the core preservation area, which was marked with amber indicators she had, in previous visits, identified as the section where the oldest specimens were located, the ones that predated the reclamation by enough years that their root systems had developed the deep mycorrhizal networks that none of the younger specimens had, the networks that were the point, the networks that were the reason her grandmother had pressed a fern in a book and said, "Shh, remember the shapes. Because the shape of a fern is the shape of a network. The shape of how things talk to each other underground, in the dark, in the language so old it had no speakers. The shape of what happens when you give living things enough time and enough connection and enough soil." Marin walked on through the forest. The compliance officer at the path junction tracked her with its sensor array, assessed her, found nothing to flag, and continued its sweep. The guide said, "Arboreal specimens in this section are designate quercus, commonly referred to in pre-reclamation human tradition as oak. These specimens range from 60 to approximately 140 years of age. The Veth Reclamation Authority notes with interest the relative longevity of Class F arboreal specimens and has allocated resources to the study of substrate conversion optimization in long-lived arboreal cellular structures. Marin looked up at an oak tree that was older than anyone on this ship, she thought. You have been alive for 140 years, and they have been on Earth for 7, and they are studying how to process you more efficiently. She thought. Not yet. She thought this quietly, without moving her lips, in the place, behind her eyes where she kept the things she thought in her grandmother's voice, in the specific warm frequency of her grandmother's voice, that she had been maintaining for 7 years, against all the forces that wanted her to stop maintaining it, that wanted her to find the amber light acceptable, that wanted her to extend her transit card, with the forward lean of someone who had learned that passive compliance was the fastest route to any destination, her grandmother had said. Forest talks to itself underground. The trees send each other sugars, warnings, water. They know when one of them is sick, and they send what they can. You can kill every tree you can see and still fail, if the root network is alive. Step 12. She had a small tool concealed in the sole of her right boot. She'd built it over 14 months from components whose individual acquisition had been unremarkable. It was not a weapon. The Veth were very good at detecting weapons, and she had no interest in making a weapon because a weapon was the last resort of someone who had run out of better ideas, and Marin had not run out of better ideas. The tool was a seed deployment needle, designed to introduce material to soil at a depth of 8 centimeters without disturbing the surface. The material it would introduce was not seeds. Seeds would have been noticed. Seeds were Class F biological matter, and their unauthorized transportation was a Tier 3 compliance violation. The material was a cultured mycorrhizal inoculant that she and her contact on Route 11 had spent 3 years developing, finding from samples she'd taken on visit 4 and 6 and 9. Adjusted for the specific chemical composition of the installation substrate, she'd analyzed from a maintenance drainage sample she'd acquired 18 months ago. The inoculant contained, encoded in a chemical signal, her contact had spent 16 months working out, a set of instructions, not instructions to grow. The network was already growing. The network was doing what networks do, which is expand and connect, and share and remember. The instructions were simpler than that. They were the instructions for a conversation. A very specific conversation, to be conducted in the only language the Veth had never thought to monitor, because they had designated it, Class F, insufficient value, worth watching. The instructions said, here is where the boundary of the installation meets the ship's of atmospheric system. Here is where the filtration units draw intake. Here is the sequence for producing in quantity at a rate calculable from the root mass you currently have access to, a compound that the Veth respiratory system is not designed to process at elevated concentrations. Trees wouldn't die. She'd been extremely careful about that. The compound was metabolic exhaust. Byproduct, the mycorrhizal network produced naturally at low levels. At low levels, the system was not designed to produce it at scale, preached. But the network, given the right instructions passed through the right chemical signals, given the information that its boundary touched an atmospheric intake, given the biological imperative that all root networks share, which is imperative to expand and to protect what is connected to them, the network was capable of making the adjustment. It would take, contact estimated, between 6 and 10 weeks from full inoculation. The Veth would notice. Of course they would notice. They would notice the atmospheric compound readings. They would identify the source. They would shut down Exhibition Zone 7 and initiate a substrate analysis. And they would find the inoculant. She had no illusions about the endgame of this specific action. This specific action was not the endgame. This specific action was a message. It was a demonstration. It was a proof, sent to every human on this ship, and on the 12 other ships where her contact had contacts of their own, who were all on different steps of the same sequence, using the same notebooks, working in the same margins, in the same small cramped handwriting that had been passed down through the same kind of families who pressed ferns in books and hid them in the Linings of travel packs. The message was this: we were never just specimens. We were never insufficient yield. We kept the root networks alive, and the root networks kept us, and you cannot catalog what is alive in the dark and call it sufficiently processed, because it will find the atmospheric intake, and it will use the only language it has ever had, which is the language of being alive and insisting on it, and it will speak. Reached the amberlit boundary of the core preservation area. She stopped on the path. She stood there for a long moment. The guide was occupied with the group 40 meters back. One of the children had asked a question. The only question a child ever asked in this room, question the guide was not programmed to answer well, which was, where did all the rest of them go? And the guide was producing its standard response about reclamation processes and substrate optimization. And the compliance officer at the North Junction had its array oriented toward the child, because the child's elevated vocal affect had triggered its attention protocol, and the Southern Junction officer was in the middle of its 90-second sweep cycle, which Marin had timed on visits 4, 6, 7, 9, 10, and 12, and which was consistent. She's 14. She stepped off the path. The leaves were under her feet. The real leaves. The dead ones from last season's cycle. The ones the installation's caretaking systems had been told to leave because the Veth archivist had noted the decomposition was characteristic of a natural forest environment, and the educational value of the installation included authentic ecological process representation, which meant that under Marin's boots was soil that had been cycling and building and breathing in the old way. In the way that soil does when you leave it alone long enough. She crouched. She pressed the tool into the ground. 8 centimeters. She counted. She'd practiced the motion so many times on calibrated testing material in her residential unit that her hands knew the depth by feeling, not by thought, and her hands were very steady, and the leaves were very quiet under her knees, and the forest smelled like green, like the color green, like something her grandmother had said she would recognize when she was in it, even if she'd never been in it before. And she was in it, and she recognized it. She activated the tool. She withdrew it, stood up, stepped back onto the path, and was walking in the direction of the group by the time the Southern officer's sweep came back around. 42 seconds. She'd run long by 2. Compliance record would show a visitor in Zone 7. Path trajectory consistent with observation behavior. No specimen contact detected. She walked back toward the group. The child was still asking questions. The guide was answering with its language of substrate yield and reclamation, efficiency, and the child kept asking, because children in Marin's experience were very good at finding those questions that didn't have an acceptable answer and asking it over and over, until someone either told them the truth or showed them why the truth couldn't be said out loud. Marin crouched down next to the girl. She was maybe 6 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and the particular expression of a child who has been something that doesn't add up. The child said, "But where did the trees go?" Marin looked at her. She said, "They're not all gone." The child looked up at the forest. She looked back at Marin. Marin said, "Some of them are here, and some of them are waiting." She said it in the calm voice, in the even voice, in the voice her grandmother had used when she read from the field guide in the apartment with the windows sealed, the voice that was just a voice telling a child something true, and the guide behind her processed the statement and found nothing to flag, and the compliance officer's array swept across them both and found 2 humans in a compliance-consistent emotional register, the system logged as Cultural Exchange Engagement Standard. Marin stood up. She walked back toward the conveyance with the group. The old man fell in beside her. He said nothing. He smelled faintly, she noticed, of something, some personal effect, some remnant of a life before the ship. She didn't ask. They walked side by side or through Exhibition Zone 7, with the trees around them doing what trees do, which is breathe and grow and conduct their slow subterranean conversation. And now, 8 centimeters below the surface of the core preservation area, the conversation had a new participant. All visitors please return to the conveyance, the guide said. Today's route is complete. Thank you for participating in the Veth Cultural Exchange Program. We hope today's experience has contributed to your understanding of Class F biological matter, and the Veth Reclamation Authority's commitment to cross-species educational engagement. Marin boarded the conveyance. She found her seat. She opened her notebook to the last used page, and she drew a small mark in the margin. 11 marks in the margin. This was the 12th. She needed 3 more. She looked out the viewport as the conveyance pulled away from Exhibition Zone 7, and she watched the forest until it was out of sight, and she felt the specific weight of what was now living in that soil, alongside what had always been living there, the new instruction set, the message encoded in chemistry and mycorrhizal signal, waiting to be read. Her grandmother had said, "They called it a weed, when they wanted you to think it had no right to be there. A weed is just a plant that decided to live somewhere they didn't plan for it." The conveyance moved through the transit corridor. The amber light settled over everything. Marin wrote in the notebook, "Step 12 complete. The roots know where the air is." She closed the notebook. She put it in her pocket. She looked at the other passengers, and they looked back at her, or they looked at their communication devices, or they looked at nothing, and none of them knew what she had done. And some of them would know eventually, and some of them were doing their own version of it right now on other routes. And the Veth compliance systems continued their sweep patterns, and the mycorrhizal network in Exhibition Zone 7 can continue expansion into the carefully maintained soil. And somewhere in the chemical structure of what Marin had introduced to it was the first word of a conversation in a language so old it had no speakers, so old it had no speakers until now. In 6 weeks, the atmospheric monitors in the residential sector closest to the forest installation would register an anomalous compound at 0.3 parts per million. In 7 weeks, it would be 1.1 parts per million. In 8 weeks, a Veth maintenance team would be dispatched to Exhibition Zone 7 to investigate. What they would find would not be what they expected to find, because what they expected to find was a contained system, a managed system, a Class F system of insufficient substrate yield, a museum piece, an educational exhibit, a thing that could be assessed and cataloged, and kept behind transparent composite while a guide described it in the language of yield and reclamation efficiency. What they would find was a forest that knew where the air was, Shri. A forest with 9 weeks of instructions from a root network that had been waiting in the specific patient waithanst of things that have been alive for 140 years, for someone to tell it which way to grow. And beneath the forest, in the margins and the dark, and the silence below the amber-lit observation path, the older conversation would still be happening. The one that had no speakers and needed none. The one that Marin's grandmother's grandmother's grandmother had walked through without knowing she was in it, without knowing what the soil was saying under her feet. Without knowing that the specific warm weight of a forest in August was the weight of 10,000 organisms speaking in a frequency below hearing, speaking, among other things, of persistence. The conveyance arrived at the disembarkation dock. The guide said, "Thank you for your participation." Marin stepped off. She walked down the boarding corridor with her notebook in her pocket and her hands steady and her face in its correct arrangement. The arrangement of a person who has completed an optional cultural exchange activity and found it moderately interesting. The arrangement she had been practicing since she was 11 years old, watching her grandmother hand over a book. She passed a Veth compliance officer at the junction. Its array swept over her. She was logged as female cultural exchange, compliance, record intact, no anomalies. She walked on. Behind her, in the soil of Exhibition Zone 7, something was spreading. Something was finding the low ground, the way water finds the low ground, without thought and without stops, following only the structure of the earth and the instructions of everything that had ever lived in it, which amounts to the same thing. Marin walked, and the forest breathed, and in the margins of her 63rd notebook, in letters so small they were nearly invisible, were the words, Step 13. She had 3 more visits authorized. She was going to need all of them. She was going to use every single one.